She told him to stop looking at her 3 times, with increasing conviction and decreasing success. What she never admitted, even to herself, was why it bothered her so much. We begin. The library at midnight smelled of old parchment and extinguished candles, a particular kind of quiet that Hermione had always found more honest than silence. Not empty, layered. The kind of stillness that held the memory of 1,000 arguments, 1,000 whispered revelations, 1,000 pages turned in desperation or wonder. She had spent more hours in this room than she had spent sleeping over the past 3 years, and she knew its rhythms the way she knew her own heartbeat. Reliable, constant, hers, which was exactly why she noticed when something shifted. It was not a sound. It was not movement. It was the particular quality of attention, the way the air between 2 people changes texture when one of them is being watched. Hermione felt it the way she might feel a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm, a subtle tightening across her shoulders, a prickling along the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the cold draft from the corridor beyond the double doors. She did not look up from her parchment immediately. She told herself this was discipline. She told herself she was in the middle of a sentence about the theoretical inconsistencies in Golpalot's third law, and that whatever was pressing against the edges of her awareness could wait. She dipped her quill. She wrote 4 more words. She crossed them out. Then she looked up. Draco Malfoy was sitting across the library, not near her, not at the adjacent table, but at the far reading table beneath the arched window that overlooked the Black Lake. He had a book open in front of him. His quill was in his hand, and he was not reading. He was looking at her. Not the sharp, contemptuous look she had catalogued over 6 years of proximity to him. That particular compression of his mouth, that blade-edge quality to his gaze that he deployed like a weapon. This was something else entirely, something she did not have a name for yet, which was perhaps the most disorienting thing about it. Hermione Granger had a name for nearly everything. His expression was still, the way deep water is still, and his eyes, pale as winter light, were fixed on her face with an attention that felt almost like pressure, as though he were trying to read something written in a language he was only beginning to understand. She looked back down at her parchment. Her quill left a long, unintentional mark across the page. "Stop it," she told herself. "It means nothing." He looked up from his book, and you happened to be in his line of sight. People look at things. Eyes move. It doesn't mean. She looked up again. He was still looking. The heat that moved through her was so sudden and so thorough that she nearly knocked over her inkwell. It began somewhere in the center of her chest and radiated outward with the efficiency of a well-cast warming charm, except that no warming charm had ever made her feel quite like this, quite so exposed, quite so aware of her own hands, her own breathing, the particular way she was sitting, whether her hair was doing the thing it sometimes did in humid weather, where it expanded to an almost architectural scale. She pressed her fingertips flat against the table. She breathed. Then she gathered every fragment of composure she possessed, organized it the way she organized her notes, with precision, with deliberate structure, and she looked at him directly. "Do you need something, Malfoy?" Her voice came out crisper than she intended. A teacher's voice, a prefect's voice. the voice she used when she was absolutely certain she was right about something and needed the room to understand this. He blinked. It was the slowest blink she had ever observed, unhurried, almost thoughtful, as though her question had not startled him, but had simply arrived, and he was deciding what to do with it. "No," he said. One word. Quiet, without the customary edge. "Then perhaps," Hermione said, returning her attention to her parchment with the precision of someone replacing a book on a shelf, "you could direct your attention to your own work." She heard nothing from his side of the library. No rustle of turning pages, no scratch of a quill. The silence stretched between them like something physical, not uncomfortable, which was itself a deeply uncomfortable thing to notice. She waited for a cutting remark, a sardonic laugh, the particular exhale he used when he found something beneath his consideration. None of it came. When she looked up again, 8 minutes later, she was not counting. She simply happened to note the time as a matter of academic habit. He was writing. Head bent, quill moving, the long lines of his posture suggesting nothing more remarkable than concentration. He did not look at her again that night, which should have been a relief. It was not. She told herself, walking back to Gryffindor Tower at midnight, that she was tired, that the long hours of revision had done what they always did eventually, sharpened her mind past the point of usefulness, until it began inventing patterns in things that contained no patterns. She was projecting, perhaps, reading intention into a glance, because her brain, deprived of its usual problems to solve, had apparently decided to manufacture one. The fat lady grumbled at being woken. Hermione climbed through the portrait hole and stood in the warm amber glow of the common room, which was empty at this hour, and pressed her back against the stone wall beside the fireplace. She was not going to think about the way he had looked at her. She thought about it for 45 minutes before she fell asleep. It happened again 3 days later. The great hall this time. Breakfast. The ordinary noise and warmth of morning. The soft percussion of cutlery against plates. The smell of toast and early firelight. The low murmur of hundreds of half-awake conversations. Hermione was reading, which was her standard state at meals when Harry and Ron were occupied with Quidditch arguments that required no third perspective, and she had just turned a page in advanced rune translation when she felt it again. That shift in the quality of air, that particular awareness arriving like a chord struck in an adjacent room. She looked up before she could stop herself. Draco Malfoy, at the Slytherin table, was not looking at her. He was speaking to Blaise Zabini about something that appeared to involve mild irritation. His brow held that particular configuration she had memorized without meaning to. The slight tension between his eyes that meant he found the topic either tedious or frustrating. His hands were around a cup of tea. His attention was entirely elsewhere. And yet, the feeling did not dissipate when she confirmed he wasn't watching. It lingered, prickling. She turned her eyes back to her book and found she had read the same sentence 3 times without retaining a single word. She set the book down, picked up her tea, took 1 sip. And in the exact moment, she lifted her eyes over the rim of the cup, because apparently her eyes had developed opinions of their own that bore no relationship to her intentions. She found him looking directly at her from across the hall, not caught in the act, not averting his gaze. looking at her with that same quality of attention she had catalogued in the library, steady, unhurried, particular, as though she was something worth the trouble of observing carefully. The teacup hit her saucer harder than she planned. "All right, Hermione," Ron asked, glancing sideways at her. "Fine," she said, and she straightened her sleeve cuffs, once, twice, a third time, until the fabric was absolutely perfect and her hands had somewhere to be. "I'm perfectly fine." She did not look at the Slytherin table again for the remainder of breakfast. She was aware of the Slytherin table for the remainder of breakfast, with a completeness that was frankly offensive, given how strongly she wanted not to be. The internal argument she conducted with herself over the following week was among the more exhausting she had ever engaged in, and she had once spent 3 days mentally debating the ethical implications of time travel. It went, in approximate summary, as follows. He is Draco Malfoy. This was her opening position, ironclad, self-evident. Draco Malfoy, who had called her mudblood in the casual, practiced way that revealed how thoroughly the word had been part of his vocabulary before he ever learned hers. Draco Malfoy, who had made Harry's life a sustained act of persecution for 6 years. Draco Malfoy, who had been marked by Voldemort, who had stood in the astronomy tower with a pale and shaking face, who had been given an impossible task and had lowered his wand. She pressed this thought flat every time it surfaced. It was not relevant. The fact that he had not been able to do what he was ordered to do did not transform him into someone she should be thinking about at 11:30 on a Wednesday, when she was supposed to be asleep. The counter-argument, which she did not invite and deeply resented, was less concerned with biography. The counter-argument was interested in the specific way he looked at her, the particular quality of it, which she had now experienced enough times to begin identifying its characteristics with the reluctant precision of a scientist cataloguing a new specimen. It was not the look of someone who found her contemptible. It was not the look of someone performing an emotion for an audience. It held something private in it, something that suggested he was not entirely aware of deploying it. And that specific quality of inadvertence was the most destabilizing part, because it meant she could not dismiss it as calculation. She had always been very good at dismissing Draco Malfoy's calculations. She had no established method for dismissing something he might be feeling accidentally. "You don't know what he's feeling," she told herself firmly, pulling her pillow over her face in the darkness of the dormitory, while Lavender breathed softly 3 beds away. "You are assigning interior states to a person based on the direction of his gaze, which is not evidence of anything except that you have spent too many consecutive hours in revision and your interpretive capacity has begun to deteriorate." She fell asleep approximately 90 minutes later. She dreamed about the library. In the dream, he crossed the room toward her, and she did not look away. She woke with the dream still adhering to the inside of her chest, like something warm and unwanted. And she lay in the grey early light of the dormitory and breathed carefully and took stock. She was Hermione Granger. She had read every significant text in the Hogwarts library on at least 2 occasions. She had maintained academic distinction through a war, through grief, through the sustained pressure of being Harry Potter's closest friend, and what that actually meant in practical terms. She had faced a mountain troll at 11, a basilisk at 12, the Ministry of Magic at 16. She was not going to be undone by a look. She dressed efficiently. She gathered her bag with her usual precision. She descended to breakfast early, chose a seat with her back to the Slytherin table, strategically, deliberately, a choice she told herself had nothing to do with the fact that she couldn't trust her own eyes anymore. And she opened her book. She read 4 pages. She retained none of them. When she finally turned, driven by something she refused to name, Draco Malfoy was already watching her from across the Great Hall. This time, something in her chest did not merely bloom. It pulled, a low, definitive gravity, the kind that doesn't ask permission. Her breath left her body in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. She looked away, but not before she noticed, catalogued, filed, desperately tried not to keep, that he did not look away first. He never looked away first. And that, she thought, gripping her teacup with both hands in the warm and ordinary morning light, was going to be a very significant problem. The potions classroom smelled of sulphur and burnt sage, and something underneath both of those things. Something older, mineral, like the stone walls themselves were exhaling. It was not an unpleasant smell precisely. It was simply a smell that demanded alertness, that reminded the body it was in proximity to things that could go wrong in interesting ways. Hermione had always found it clarifying, a scent that organized the mind. Today, it was doing nothing of the sort. She had arrived early, which was standard. She had arranged her ingredients with her usual methodical care. Lacewing flies counted out in a precise row. Boomslang skin measured to the gram. Her knife angled at exactly the position that allowed for the cleanest cut. She had read the instructions on the board twice, though she had memorized the strengthening solution weeks ago when Professor Slughorn had announced it as the upcoming assessment. She was, in every external particular, entirely prepared. Her notes were already open. Her quill was already in her hand. She was not thinking about Draco Malfoy. She was thinking about him with the focused intensity of someone actively, effortfully, not thinking about something. The classroom filled around her in the ordinary way. The scrape of stools, the low exchanges of students who had not yet committed to being awake, the soft thud of bags deposited on stone benches. She catalogued it all without looking up, a habit developed over years of needing to know precisely where everyone in a room was positioned without appearing to pay attention. It was a skill, she had always told herself. Situational awareness, practically defensive in nature. It was, therefore, purely in the interest of situational awareness that she registered the exact moment Draco Malfoy entered the room. She did not hear him specifically. She simply felt the slight recalibration of the air that she had come to associate over the past 9 days with his presence, a kind of atmospheric adjustment, as though the room acknowledged him the way a compass needle acknowledges north, invisible, inexorable, profoundly irritating. He took his seat at the bench diagonal to hers. She knew this without looking, because she had memorized the seating arrangement at the beginning of term with academic thoroughness and was absolutely not tracking his position relative to her own. He was 2 benches left and 1 row back. She was aware of this the way she was aware of the temperature in the room, as background data, continuous and involuntary. Slughorn arrived in a billow of velvet and enthusiasm, clapping his hands and setting cauldrons simmering with a wave that was more theatrical than necessary. And Hermione focused on the work with everything she had. For 14 minutes, it was almost sufficient. She was on the third stage of the preparation, reducing the lacewing flies over a low flame, watching the colour shift with the specific attention the process required, when she felt it. The quality of observation she had catalogued and named and argued herself out of interpreting, and was running entirely out of arguments against. He was watching her. She knew it before she looked. She knew it the way you know a room has changed behind you, not through any specific evidence, but through that ancient animal layer of awareness that exists below conscious thought. The back of her neck was warm. Her shoulders had drawn slightly inward, a posture she recognized as a response to being seen, a reflexive attempt to make herself smaller, which was so foreign to her usual way of occupying space that it registered as nearly alarming. She looked up. He was looking at her hands, not at her face, at her hands where they worked above the cauldron with the automatic precision of long practice. His expression held the same quality she had documented in the library, in the great hall, in the 4 other moments she was absolutely not cataloguing. That particular stillness, that quality of careful, private attention. As though she was something worth understanding, rather than simply something to look at. The lacewing flies in her cauldron began to scorch. She caught it in time, barely. She adjusted the flame with a controlled breath, and told herself the sudden sharp heat in her face was the steam rising from the cauldron, and was a perfectly physical, perfectly mundane phenomenon that had nothing to do with the fact that Draco Malfoy had been looking at her hands as though... As though what, exactly? She pressed the thought flat with both metaphorical hands. "Eyes on your own work, Malfoy," she said, without looking at him. Her voice came out precisely calibrated, the tone of mild authority she had refined over 6 years as the person in the room most likely to know what the correct procedure was and least likely to be thanked for mentioning it. A beat of silence. "My work is progressing adequately," he said. She looked at his cauldron. It was, in fact, progressing adequately, infuriatingly adequately. The colour was exactly right, a deep, even amber that indicated correct reduction, and his workspace was organised with a precision that she recognised, against her better judgment, as matching her own. "Then perhaps," she said, returning to her own cauldron with deliberate composure, "you could direct that attention toward the 4th stage, which requires it considerably more than I do." Another beat, longer this time. "Perhaps," he said. Just that. One word, delivered with no particular inflection, not agreeable, not sardonic, simply present. A word that occupied the space between them, like something set down carefully. She stirred her solution clockwise 3 times. She counted. She breathed. She did not look at him again for the next 20 minutes, which represented a significant act of will that she felt deserved recognition from some external authority, given that she was receiving none from her own nervous system. The difficulty, and she had spent considerable effort mapping the precise dimensions of the difficulty, was that she did not know what to do with something she could not name. Hermione Granger's entire cognitive architecture was built on naming things. Identification preceded understanding, and understanding preceded action. And action was how she moved through the world with any sense of competence or ground beneath her feet. When she had understood at 13 that the logical extension of certain arithmetical principles meant that time could be bent, she had named it, and then she had worked within it. When she had understood at 16 that she loved Ron in some tender, complicated, uncertain way, she had named it, tentatively, in the privacy of her own thoughts, and the naming had given her something to hold. But this she could not name without the name doing something irreversible to the landscape of her interior life. Attraction was too small, too physical, too transactional, too easily dismissed as a function of proximity and stress. She had been in proximity to many people. Stress was her ambient condition. Feeling was too vague. She had feelings about everything. She had strong feelings about the organizational principles of the library catalog system. The word that kept arriving, unbidden, at the threshold of her thoughts, that kept assembling itself from the raw material of 9 days' worth of evidence, was one she refused entry with something approaching desperation. Because that word changed things. That word was not a temporary condition or a passing misalignment of her emotional compass. That word was structural. That word, once admitted, rearranged everything it touched. She stood at the sink in the prefect's bathroom at 9:30 that evening, running cold water over her wrists the way her mother had taught her for headaches. A Muggle remedy, practical and without ceremony. And she looked at her own face in the mirror above the basin. She looked like herself. This was somehow the most disconcerting part. She had half expected some visible evidence of interior upheaval, shadows beneath her eyes, or a new tension in her jaw, or some quality of disturbance readable in her expression. But she looked ordinary, a little tired. Her hair was doing something ambient and complicated that had given up on any particular shape. "You are being ridiculous," she told her reflection. Her reflection looked back at her with an expression that suggested it had heard this argument before and remained unconvinced. She turned off the tap. She dried her hands with the precise, methodical movements of someone who needed something to do with them. Then she picked up her bag and walked back to Gryffindor Tower through corridors that were beginning to empty for curfew. And she thought, carefully, reluctantly, with the specific quality of attention she usually reserved for problems that were actually worth solving, about the way he had looked at her hands. Not her face, her hands. As though the thing that interested him was not what she looked like, but what she did, what she made, the specific quality of her attention when she worked. She reached the portrait of the fat lady and gave the password in a voice that came out steadier than she deserved. "This changes nothing," she told herself, climbing through the portrait hole. Harry looked up from the sofa by the fire and said, "Rough day." "No," she said, "productive." She climbed the stairs to the dormitory and lay down without changing and stared at the canopy above her bed. It changes nothing, she thought again. Below the thought, quiet and persistent as water finding the low ground, something disagreed. The moment of genuine crisis arrived on a Thursday without warning, in the form of a dropped book. It was not a dramatic book. It was Intermediate Transfiguration Theory, Volume 2, which she had been carrying along with 4 other texts. her bag, her prefect's badge folder, and a rolled scroll of parchment that contained 12 inches of analysis she needed to deliver to Professor McGonagall. She had perhaps misjudged the structural integrity of the arrangement. The book slid from the pile at the exact moment she was navigating the turn from the third-floor corridor into the narrower passage that led toward the library, and it hit the flagstone floor with a resonance that briefly silenced the general ambient noise of the school. She stopped. She looked at it. She calculated what it would require to crouch and retrieve it without losing the rest of the pile. Here. She did not startle. She was almost certain she did not startle. There may have been a slight, involuntary adjustment of her posture. Draco Malfoy was crouching beside the book before she had fully processed that he was in the corridor. He straightened in one fluid motion and held it out to her. She stared at it for precisely 1 second too long. He looked, in this particular configuration, standing in the third-floor corridor in the late afternoon light that came through the high window at an angle that was frankly gratuitous, holding her textbook out to her with that expression that she was running out of alternative explanations for. He looked. She took the book. Their fingers did not touch. She was specifically aware that their fingers did not touch, because she was specifically aware of a complicated reaction to the prospect of their fingers touching that she needed to not be having in a public corridor. "I didn't ask for your help," she said. "No," he agreed. "I was managing. You were about to lose the entire stack." She looked at the remaining books in her arms. This was, in the strict technical sense, accurate. The scroll was already beginning a slow migration toward the edge of the pile with the serene inevitability of geological movement. "I would have recovered it," she said. He looked at her. That look, the one she didn't have a name for yet, patient, particular, quietly attentive, in a way that made her feel simultaneously very seen and very unequal to being seen. "I know," he said. "You recover everything." The words arrived without inflection, without apparent irony. They simply sat in the space between them in the third-floor corridor while the late afternoon light stretched across the flagstones, and somewhere distant a door opened and released a brief wave of chatter that faded again to quiet. Something in her chest moved in a way that she had no established framework for, and that she urgently needed to not be examining in a corridor where anyone could walk past. "Don't do that," she said. Her voice came out lower than she intended, less certain. He tilted his head, fractionally. "Do what?" "That." She shifted her books against her chest and straightened her spine and looked at him with everything she had, all her precision, all her hard-won composure. "Say things like that." A pause. Something moved in his expression, too quickly for her to read it. A ripple across that careful surface. Then it stilled again. "I'll note it," he said. He stepped back. He turned and walked back down the corridor in the direction he had come from, unhurried, without looking back. His footsteps against the flagstones were even, measured, fading. Hermione stood in the corridor for a moment longer than was warranted. Then she straightened the scroll, redistributed the books, and walked toward the library with her shoulders set, and her jaw fixed, and her heartbeat conducting itself in a manner that was completely unacceptable and thoroughly without her permission. "You recover everything," he had said. She pressed the words down somewhere deep and quiet, and walked faster, as though velocity might help. As though she could simply outpace the particular damage of having been, for one unguarded moment in an ordinary corridor, understood. Rain arrived at Hogwarts the way it sometimes did in November. Not gradually, not with the courteous forewarning of darkening clouds and shifting wind, but all at once, as though the sky had simply decided. One moment the grounds were grey and still. The next, water was running in sheets down the ancient glass of the corridor windows, and the castle absorbed the sound of it the way it absorbed everything, deeply into its stones, into the particular resonance of its walls, until the rain became indistinguishable from the building itself. Hermione sat in the window alcove on the 4th floor, the one behind the tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy, which most students never thought to look behind, which was precisely why she had claimed it 3 years ago as a place to think when the common room was too loud and the library too populated, and she needed the specific quality of solitude that only came from being genuinely unfindable. She had her knees drawn up. She had a book open across them. She had been reading the same page for 22 minutes. Outside, the black lake had disappeared entirely into the rain. The mountains beyond were suggestions, dark masses behind moving grey curtains, present in theory rather than in any confirmable visual sense. She watched a rivulet make its way down the outer surface of the glass in a path that had the appearance of decision, of intention, though she knew it was simply the mathematics of gravity and surface tension. There was no intention. There was only the inevitable finding of the lowest point. She thought, with the resigned precision of someone who has stopped pretending otherwise, about Draco Malfoy. 11 days since the library, 8 days since the Great Hall, 4 days since the potions classroom, and the lacewing flies scorching, and his voice saying my work is progressing adequately with that particular quality of neutrality that managed to communicate more than any inflected statement should. 2 days since the corridor, since you recover everything. She pressed her thumbnail against the edge of the page until the paper bent. The problem, and she was approaching it now as a problem, formally, with the part of her mind that was most reliable under pressure, was that he was not behaving the way her entire established understanding of him required. She had 6 years of data, 6 years of sneering precision, of pointed cruelty deployed with the ease of someone who had practiced it from childhood, of interactions that left her feeling diminished in ways she had learned to convert into fuel. She knew how to be around that version of him. She had built specific internal infrastructure for it, walls with a particular architecture calibrated to exactly his dimensions. The walls were the wrong shape now, because that version of him, the one who dropped her book and held it out without being asked, without commentary, without the particular smile he used to carry like a weapon. That version required different infrastructure entirely, and she had not built it, and she was not certain she could, and she was even less certain she should want to. You don't have to do anything, she told herself, which was the most dishonest thing she had thought in recent memory, because the whole catastrophic weight of this situation was that she could feel herself already doing something, already shifting, already leaving spaces in her internal architecture that had not previously been there. Spaces the precise shape of a person she had spent 6 years being certain she knew entirely. She turned the page she had not read and tried to read the next one. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice. Footsteps. The particular rhythm of someone who was not looking for the alcove behind the Barnabas tapestry, but had nonetheless pushed the tapestry aside and found it, which meant he had either been here before or he simply walked through obscured spaces with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to knowing what buildings contained. The tapestry moved. He stopped. For a moment they simply looked at each other. She with her knees still drawn up, her books still open across them, her hair doing something complicated from the ambient humidity. He with one hand still holding the tapestry aside, his robes dry, which meant he had not been out in the rain, his expression doing the thing where it held very still and gave her nothing readable, and somehow that absence of information was itself a kind of information. "This alcove," Hermione said, with the careful composure of someone who had been startled and was determined not to show it, "is not marked on any student map." "No," he agreed. "Most people don't know it exists. Most people don't look behind tapestries. A beat." "Are you going to stand there holding the tapestry?" she asked. He considered this for a moment that lasted slightly longer than necessary. Then he stepped in and let the tapestry fall behind him, and the alcove, which had always felt adequately spacious when she was its only occupant, immediately rearranged itself around the fact of his presence. The rain was very loud against the glass. The grey light flattened everything to silver and shadow. He looked at the window. She looked at her book. Neither of them spoke for long enough that the silence acquired a texture. Not uncomfortable, which continued to be the most uncomfortable thing about it, but inhabited. Warm in a way that the damp November air made conspicuous. "I didn't know you came here," she said finally. The statement emerged more honestly than she intended, without the crisp authority she usually kept ready. Simply a fact, delivered as one. "I don't, generally." He was still looking at the window. His reflection in the rain-blurred glass was partial, impressionistic. Pale hair, sharp jaw, the dark line of his shoulder. "I was walking. In the corridors. In the corridors." She waited for something more. He did not offer it, which with most people would have indicated conversational closure, and with him indicated something she had not yet fully decoded. She returned her attention to her book with the performance of someone who was genuinely reading, and held it for approximately 45 seconds. "You can sit," she said, "if you're going to stay." She did not know why she said it. He sat, not beside her on the window bench, but on the stone ledge across from it, his back against the alcove wall, his long legs extending toward her side of the space without quite reaching it. He had a look of someone who had been walking because sitting had not been a workable option and had now, unexpectedly, found one. She told herself she noticed this only because she was observant by nature. She told herself this with diminishing conviction. "What are you reading?" he asked. "Transfiguration theory. For the assessment. For my own interest." A small silence. Then, unexpectedly, "What's the theoretical inconsistency in Golpalot's third law?" She looked up sharply. His expression was not quite neutral, she realized. There was something in it that might, in different lighting, have been called careful curiosity. The kind that knows it is taking a small risk and has decided the risk is acceptable. "You've read Gulp a lot," she said. "I've read most things in the library. You—" She stopped, reorganized. "The inconsistency is in the assumption of proportional antidote complexity. Gulp a lot assumes a linear relationship between poison complexity and antidote complexity. But Belby's research in the 60s demonstrated non-linear scaling in compound venoms, which means the third law holds only in simple cases and breaks down entirely in—" She stopped again. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her hands in potions, with that particular attentive quality, as though the content was less important than the fact of her saying it. "You know the inconsistency already." "I wanted to hear your version of it," he said. The rain made its sound against the glass. The castles settled around them in the way old stone settles, with depth, with weight, with a suggestion of permanence. Hermione's book was no longer even nominally open. She did not remember closing it. "Why?" she asked. He looked at the window again. His jaw held a slight tension that she had not noticed until it shifted, a releasing, almost imperceptible. "Your version of things tends to be more interesting than the standard one." The heat that moved through her at this was different from what she had felt before. Not the sharp, destabilizing warmth of being watched, but something quieter, something that settled rather than flared, which was somehow worse, because flaring things passed, and this felt like it was finding a place to stay. "You've been watching me," she said. She had not planned to say it. It arrived in her mouth already formed, the way truths sometimes did when she had spent too long deliberately not saying them. He did not deny it. He looked back at her from the rain-blurred window with his pale eyes, and he did not construct an alternative explanation or deflect with the particular defensive wit she would have expected a year ago. He simply let the statement exist between them without argument. "Yes," he said. One word. The same word he had given her in the library 11 days ago. But different now, carrying different weight, offering something more than simple confirmation, offering, perhaps, the fact of its honesty. Hermione breathed. Her fingers moved against the cover of her closed book, pressing the worn leather, finding the texture of it, needing something concrete beneath her hands. She was aware of every point of her own physical presence in a way that felt new and slightly vertiginous. The specific position of her shoulders, the angle of her knees, the fact that somewhere in the last 10 minutes she had leaned 3 inches forward from her original position against the alcove wall without noticing. "That," she said, and her voice was low and not quite steady, "is not—" She stopped. "Not what?" He was watching her with that quality of attention that she was running out of alternative names for and deeply resented. "You shouldn't," she said. "Look at me like that." A stillness in him, brief but complete. "Like what?" he said. She opened her mouth, closed it, because the answer was right there, assembled from 11 days of evidence, and it was devastatingly simple, and saying it aloud would do something irreversible to the landscape of this conversation and every conversation that followed it. And she was not. She was simply not ready for irreversible. Not today. Not in a rain-blurred alcove on the 4th floor with November pressing grey and insistent against the glass. "Like that," she said instead. A non-answer, a closed door. He looked at her for a moment longer, Then something in his expression shifted, not closing exactly, but accepting the door for what it was. The patience in it was quiet and oddly without judgment. "All right," he said. He looked back at the window. She looked back at her book, genuinely this time, or trying to, the words assembling themselves on the page with more cooperation than they'd offered all evening. They sat in the alcove while the rain continued its work against the glass, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and the silence between them had the quality of something being carefully, mutually maintained. Fragile, not because it was unhappy, but because it was unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things required attention to survive. When she finally left, gathering her books and her bag and slipping back through the tapestry into the ordinary corridor light, she paused on the other side with the heavy fabric still moving behind her. She could hear him breathing in the alcove, steady, present. She stood there for 3 seconds longer than she needed to. Then she walked away and carried the warmth of those 3 seconds all the way back to Gryffindor Tower, and did not examine them, and thought about nothing else. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday, which felt wrong. Tuesdays were ordinary. Tuesdays were double charms, and a free period after lunch, and the particular institutional smell of the castle that intensified midweek when the heating charms in the lower corridors began their slow, seasonal deterioration. Tuesdays did not feel like the appropriate container for the conversation she had been building inside herself for 14 days, assembling it in the margins of lectures, in the space between sleep and waking, in the 40 seconds of every morning when she stood at the dormitory window and watched the grounds come slowly visible through the early light, and told herself today she would be sensible. She had been sensible for 14 days. She was, on this particular Tuesday, done with sensible. It began in the library. Of course, it began in the library. The library was apparently the designated location for every significant recalibration her interior life had undergone this term, which she found both fitting and faintly absurd. All these irreversible moments occurring among reference texts and study carols, and the particular hush of a space dedicated to the orderly accumulation of knowledge. She had come at 7 in the evening with the intention of finishing her arithmancy essay, which was due Thursday and was currently 11 inches when it needed to be 14, and the additional 3 inches were proving resistant. She had her books arranged. She had her notes organized by sub-argument. She had 2 quills sharpened to precisely the right fineness. She had been sitting for approximately 8 minutes when he arrived. He did not sit near her. He took his customary position at the table beneath the arched window. The same table as the first night, same chair, same long configuration of limbs that she had memorized with the helpless thoroughness of someone who has been paying attention against their own advice. He set his bag down. He opened his book. He appeared, in every observable particular, to be a person who had come to the library to read. And then he looked at her. Not immediately. Not the moment he sat down, which might have been easier to dismiss as coincidence or idle distraction. He waited, or perhaps he did not wait. Perhaps it was simply the inevitability of it, the way his attention moved toward her the way that water moved down glass. And then he looked at her, and the quality of it was the same as it had always been. Patient, particular, devastating in its steadiness. Something in Hermione's chest made a decision independently of the rest of her. She put her quill down. She gathered herself. Not her books, not her bag, just herself. All the collected force of 14 days of restraint and argument and sleepless examination. And she stood, and she walked across the library to his table with the measured deliberateness of someone who knows exactly what they are about to do and has decided the consequences are acceptable. She sat down across from him without being invited. He watched her do this without expression. "I need you to stop," she said. Her voice was quiet. This was important to her, that she was not sharp, not brittle, not wielding the prefect's authority she sometimes used as a defensive structure. She was simply speaking in the low and careful tone of someone who means every syllable. He closed his book with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to everything. His hands rested on the cover. He looked at her with that look. "Stop," he said. "Looking at me the way you do." A pause. Around them, the library continued its quiet business. The distant sound of pages, the soft percussion of someone's quill against parchment 2 rows over, the particular hush of the high-vaulted ceiling, absorbing everything and returning it muffled and distant. "What way is that?" he asked. She pressed her palms flat against the table. The wood was cool beneath them, worn smooth by decades of students, solid in a way that helped. "You know what way. I'd like to hear you say it. That is..." She stopped, drew breath. "That is an unreasonable request." Something moved in his expression. Not a smile. Nothing as legible as a smile. But a slight shift at the corner of his mouth that suggested he found something in the situation worthy of note. "You came over here, Granger. I'm in the middle of a sentence. You weren't reading. I was thinking. You were looking at me. Those aren't mutually exclusive." The heat that arrived in her face at this was swift and thorough, and she was furious at it, at the specific betrayal of her own circulatory system at the precise moment she needed every possible resource deployed toward composure. She kept her hands flat on the table. She kept her voice even. "I need you to understand," she said, "that it makes things difficult." He was very still. "What things?" "Everything," she thought. "My arithmancy essay, sleep, the structural integrity of every argument I have ever made about who you are and who I am, and why those two things exist in permanently separate territories." "Concentration," she said. He looked at her with those winter-pale eyes, and she had the specific, unwelcome sensation of being read, of being a text he had spent considerable time with and was now encountering with the accumulated comprehension of close study. It was not a comfortable sensation. It was not entirely an uncomfortable one. "I make you lose concentration," he said. "Not a question. Your staring makes it difficult to..." "I'm not staring. You are looking at me with..." She stopped, started again. "You look at me in a way that is..." Another stop. She pressed her thumbnail into the wood grain of the table with measured force. "It is distracting," she said finally, which was the truest and most inadequate thing she could have said. Draco Malfoy was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, both of them on the closed cover of his book, still, composed. Then he looked back up at her. "Why does it bother you?" he asked. The question was simple. It was the simplest question he could possibly have asked, and it landed in her chest with the precise, devastating force of something that had been aimed accurately. She recognized, in the 2 seconds of silence that followed it, the specific shape of a trap she had walked into with complete awareness of its existence, because some part of her had apparently decided that being caught was preferable to another 14 days of walking around it. Because, she said, he waited. He was very good at waiting. She was beginning to understand this about him, that beneath the surface precision of his manner was a fundamental patience that she had previously misread as detachment. He was not detached. He was attending carefully, and he was willing to do so for as long as the situation required. It was one of the most disarming things she had ever encountered. Because, she said again, and her voice was lower now, the careful steadiness of it costing her more than it had before. It makes me feel as though you can see something. Silence. What something? He asked. His voice had shifted too, quieter, stripped of the neutrality he usually wore like a second set of robes. Something underneath it that was neither cold nor warm, but simply present. She looked at him directly. This took more effort than she had remaining capacity to pretend it didn't. His face in the library light, the candles low in their sconces at this hour, the shadows finding the particular angles of him, the way the light caught the pale of his hair, was the face she had been failing not to think about for 14 days. And looking at it directly across 3 feet of worn library table with no defensible purpose between them was an entirely different experience from managing it at a distance. I don't have an answer for that, she said, which was a lie. It was the most specific lie she had told in recent memory. She had an answer. She had possessed it for approximately 9 days. She had examined it from every available angle with the exhaustive thoroughness she brought to academic problems that genuinely mattered. She simply could not say it across 3 feet of library table on a Tuesday without doing something irreversible. He held her gaze for a long moment. In it, she could see him weighing the lie. She was almost certain she could see this, that specific quality of attention that meant he had noticed the gap between what she said and what she meant, and was deciding what to do with it. He did not call her on it. Instead, he said very quietly, "It's not something I do deliberately." She blinked. "Looking at you," he said. "It isn't. I'm not doing it to unsettle you." The candlelight moved. Somewhere in the library, a book was reshelved with a soft, definitive sound. Hermione sat with the weight of this statement and felt it do something to her internal architecture. Not demolishing, nothing so dramatic. Simply finding one specific point of tension and easing it, the way heat eases a muscle that has been braced too long. "Then why?" she asked. The question was out before she had sanctioned it. She watched something move through his expression, that swift, deep ripple. And for a moment, she thought he would retreat behind the composed surface he maintained with such evident effort. She watched him decide not to. "Because you are," he said, and stopped. Started again. "You are the most." He stopped once more. His jaw tightened fractionally. He looked, for a brief and startling moment, like someone who had arrived at the edge of something and was calculating whether the ground on the other side would hold. "You make it difficult," he said finally, "to look elsewhere." The silence that followed was enormous. Not empty, the opposite of empty. It was filled to its absolute capacity with everything neither of them had said, and everything both of them had clearly meant, and the specific, trembling quality of a moment in which something has shifted and cannot be shifted back. Hermione's hands were still flat on the table. His was still on his book. 3 feet of worn library wood between them, and the distance felt at once very large and completely theoretical. "That," she said at last, and her voice was almost nothing, "is not helpful information, Malfoy." "No," he agreed. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I'm going to go finish my essay," she said. "All right." She stood. She was pleased to find that her legs functioned correctly. She gathered herself, again, just herself, and walked back across the library to her table with the measured step of someone who was not thinking about the fact that she could feel his attention following her every step of the way. She sat. She picked up her quill. She looked at her parchment. She wrote 6 inches of arithmancy essay in 40 minutes, which was better than she had managed all week, and she told herself this was because the conversation had cleared the air, resolved the tension, restored equilibrium. She did not look at him. He did not look away. Both of these things were absolutely, catastrophically untrue, and she knew it with every fraction of her considerable intelligence. And she wrote on anyway, into the long, quiet evening, while the candles burned low and the library settled around them like something that had been waiting patiently for them to arrive at exactly this point. She made a list. This was, she recognized even as she was doing it, a symptom rather than a solution. The specific coping mechanism she deployed when her emotional life exceeded the boundaries of what she could manage through direct confrontation. When things became too large and too shapeless to hold, she translated them into the linear, into the innumerable, into something with the appearance of order. She had made lists about Ron. She had made lists about the war. She had once, at 14, made a list of every identifiable variable in her feelings about Victor Crumb, which had been illuminating in the way that lists always were. Not because they solved anything, but because they made the problem visible in a way that raw feeling did not. She made this list on the inside back cover of a Charms notebook, in her smallest handwriting, on a Saturday morning when Lavender and Parvati had gone to Hogsmeade and the dormitory was entirely hers. Reasons this is not possible. She numbered them. She was thorough. She wrote about history, the specific, documented history of his behavior across 6 years, the words he had used, the precise occasions on which he had deployed cruelty with the ease of someone for whom it required no effort. She wrote about fundamental incompatibility, her values, his background, the specific architecture of everything they had each been built to believe. She wrote about Harry and Ron, about what it would mean, about the practical impossibility of a thing that existed in direct opposition to every significant relationship in her life outside of it. She wrote 7 reasons. She looked at them. She was aware, looking at them, of a specific intellectual dishonesty in the exercise, that she was constructing arguments against a conclusion she had already reached, rather than genuinely interrogating the evidence. She was, in the precise academic sense, working backward from a desired outcome, which was something she identified in other people's reasoning and found deeply frustrating, and was apparently entirely capable of doing herself when sufficiently motivated. She closed the notebook. She opened it again and looked at the list. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote, in handwriting that was slightly less controlled than her usual, reasons. This might not be impossible. She sat with the pen above the page for a long time. The dormitory was very quiet. Through the window, the November grounds were doing something complicated with low cloud and occasional pale light. Not quite raining, not quite not raining, that specific intermediate state where the air itself seemed undecided. She wrote one thing. He looks at me like I am worth looking at. She stared at it. Then she closed the notebook with the decisive finality of someone shelving a completed argument, put it at the very bottom of her bag beneath 3 textbooks and a spare pair of gloves, and went down to the common room to find something useful to do with herself. The problem with retreat, she discovered over the following 3 days, was that it required somewhere to retreat to. She had always been good at this, at the strategic withdrawal into work, into structure, into the reliable architecture of academic purpose. When things became difficult, she had always been able to find solid ground in a library, in a problem, in the specific satisfaction of understanding something thoroughly. It had never failed her. It was, she had always believed, one of her most reliable capacities. She had not previously attempted to retreat from something that had taken up residence inside her own chest. The work was there. She applied herself to it with genuine force. 12 inches of transfiguration theory, a full revision of her potions notes, 2 chapters ahead in advanced arithmancy. She sat in the library for 4 hours on Saturday afternoon and kept her eyes on her books with the sustained discipline of an act of will. She did not look at the table beneath the arched window. She did not register whether it was occupied. She did not notice the specific quality of the library's atmosphere or whether it held anything she recognized. She did all of this with complete success, and it helped not at all. Because the work, which had always before been sufficient, which had been the place she went when the world was too loud, when grief was too close, when she needed to remember that she was capable and purposeful and in command of at least one significant territory of her existence. The work now contained him, because she had told him about Golpalot's 3rd law in a rain-blurred alcove while November pressed against the glass. And he had said, "Your version of things tends to be more interesting than the standard one." And now, every time she opened a textbook, some part of her mind offered this information unprompted. She closed advanced arithmancy on Sunday evening and sat in the common room armchair nearest the fire and stared into it with an expression that Ron, arriving from practice with mud on his boots and his hair doing something catastrophic, clocked immediately. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." He sat across from her with the particular wariness of someone who had known her for 7 years and understood that nothing in this specific intonation meant something significant that I am not going to tell you about. He looked at her for a moment. He looked at the fire. He looked back at her. "Is it the arithmancy assessment?" "No." "McGonagall's essay?" "No, Ron. Because Harry said you already finished the—" "It isn't academic," she said, which stopped him, because in 7 years of friendship this was a relatively unusual statement. She watched him recalibrate. "Right," he said carefully. "Do you want to?" "No." A pause. "Okay," he said, with the generosity of someone who understood the difference between being needed and being helpful, and picked up a copy of Witch Broomstick from the floor beside him and let her have the fire in silence. She sat with the warmth of it on her face and thought about what it meant that the only two people who knew her best in the world were the two people she could not tell this to. That the specific secret she was carrying had no safe container in the life she had built, because the life she had built was organized around a set of loyalties that she was not willing to damage, and that would be damaged, she was fairly certain, by the words, "I think I am in love with Draco Malfoy." The thought arrived fully formed in those exact words for the first time. She looked at it. She had spent 2 weeks refusing it entry. She had pressed it flat and renamed it, and argued against its evidence with every tool she had. She had deployed the list. She had deployed the retreat. She had, on 3 separate occasions, given herself extremely thorough lectures on the nature of projection and the unreliability of emotional responses generated under conditions of sustained academic stress. And here it was anyway, assembled and present and completely, devastatingly legible. "I think I am in love with Draco Malfoy." The fire made its sound. Ron turned a page. The common room moved around her in its ordinary Saturday evening way. Someone's wireless playing low, the murmur of a card game from the table by the window, Ginny's laugh from somewhere on the stairs. Hermione sat inside the knowledge and felt it occupy her, not like an invasion, which was what she had expected, but like something finding its correct location, like a book replaced on the right shelf after weeks in the wrong one. The discomfort of it was real and considerable. The relief of it was equally real and considerably more frightening. She breathed. She thought about the alcove, the rain, the way he had said all right when she told him not to look at her like that. Not as a concession, not as mockery, but with the specific quality of someone accepting something they do not intend to stop feeling, simply because she has asked them to. She thought about the library. You make it difficult to look elsewhere. She thought about the corridor. You recover everything. He had been telling her, she realized, with the particular indirection of someone who did not know how to say things plainly, or perhaps had learned very young that saying things plainly was not safe. He had been telling her in the vocabulary available to him, something that she had understood and refused to receive. She pressed her fingertips against her collarbone. Just briefly, just to feel something concrete. Then she unfolded herself from the armchair with the deliberate composure of someone who has made an internal decision significant enough to require physical marking, and she said, "Good night, Ron," and she climbed the stairs. She did not make any further lists. Monday arrived with thin winter sunlight that had no real warmth in it, and a charms lesson that she navigated on 4 hours of sleep with the specific quality of attentiveness that came not from rest, but from the kind of internal clarity that sometimes followed a decision, even an unacted decision, even one that existed only as knowledge rather than as anything she had done with the knowledge. She saw him in the corridor between charms and transfiguration. Not a significant encounter, not a conversation. Simply the ordinary spatial intersection of 2 people moving through the same stone corridor in the same direction at the same time. He was 20 feet ahead, walking with Zabini, and she was behind him with her books against her chest and Harry saying something about the upcoming Quidditch match beside her. He did not look back. She watched the line of his shoulders, the particular set of them, composed, controlled, the posture of someone who had learned very young to take up space with authority and had continued to do so even when the authority had become more complicated. She watched the way he moved through the corridor with that characteristic, unhurried precision, students parting around him without apparent awareness of doing so. She thought, "I know what you sound like when you say one word." She thought, "I know what your hands look like when you are deciding whether to say something true." She thought, "I have been looking at you too, and I don't know when that started, and I think it started before any of this, and that is the most frightening thing of all." Harry said something else about Quidditch. "Yes," she said, "absolutely." She had no idea what she was agreeing to. Ahead of her in the corridor, Draco Malfoy turned a corner and was gone, and the space he left had a specific quality to it. Not absence, not relief, but the particular atmosphere of a room just after something significant has happened in it. A changed air, a rearranged pressure. She had spent 2 weeks trying to retreat from this. She had retrieved absolutely nothing except the confirmation that there was nowhere far enough to go. Her footsteps echoed on the flagstones. Harry was still talking. The thin winter light came through the high windows and fell across the stone floor in long, pale bars that she walked through without thinking, one after another, each one cold and bright and briefly warm at its edges. She thought, all right, not a surrender, not a capitulation to something she hadn't chosen, simply an acknowledgement. The same quality of word he had offered her in the alcove returned now in the privacy of her own chest. All right, this is what is true. This is what I am carrying. This is the shape of the thing. Now what? The second time she found the alcove occupied, she had not been looking for company. She had been looking for the specific quality of solitude that the alcove provided, that particular unfindable quiet behind the Barnabas tapestry, above the rain-soaked grounds, where she could exist without performing any version of herself for anyone's benefit. She had been looking for it with some urgency, because the evening had been the kind that accumulated pressure in layers. A study group that ran too long, a letter from her mother that asked questions she didn't know how to answer, a conversation with Ginny that had come perilously close to the territory she was not ready to inhabit in company. She pushed the tapestry aside. He was there, not sitting this time, standing at the window with his back to her, both hands in his pockets, looking out at the grounds where the rain had finally, after 3 days, stopped. The clouds had broken toward evening into something ragged and vast, and the moon was moving between them in the intermittent way that made the grounds shift between silver and shadow in a slow and breathing rhythm. She should have stepped back. The tapestry was still in her hand. She could have retreated without him knowing she had been there, and the evening would have proceeded differently. She would have found somewhere else, the common room perhaps, or the library, and none of what followed would have happened. She did not step back. She stepped in and let the tapestry fall, and the sound of its settling made him turn. He looked at her. She looked at him. In the moonlight and shadow, his face was different, or rather, It was the same face she had catalogued over weeks of unwilling observation, but stripped of the daytime context that always surrounded it. No other students, no performance of normalcy on either side. Just the alcove and the broken cloud, and the particular honesty that late hours sometimes imposed on people who had run out of the energy required for pretense. He looked tired. This was the first thing she registered, and it registered with a specific quality of concern that she did not entirely know what to do with. A pulling in her chest, a want to say something, which she pressed back because she had not earned the right to say something about this yet, and was not certain he would want her to. He looked tired in the way that had nothing to do with sleep. The kind of tired that came from carrying something heavy over a long distance without being able to set it down. She had seen this look before. She had seen it in mirrors. "I didn't know you came here," he said, an echo of what she had said to him 3 weeks ago in the rain. "Generally, I do," she said. "When I need—" She stopped, chose honesty over deflection because the hour was late and the moon was moving, and she was tired of the weight of pretending. When it becomes necessary to be somewhere that isn't anywhere for a while. He turned back to the window. She stayed where she was, near the tapestry, not committing to the space in either direction. "That's a precise way of putting it," he said. "I'm a precise person." "I know." The moon slid behind a cloud. The alcove dimmed to near darkness, and then, as the cloud thinned at its edges, returned to silver. She watched his reflection in the glass, that partial, impressionistic version of him, the one that existed only in surfaces and peripheral vision, which she had accumulated without intending to, alongside the direct observations she had also accumulated without intending to. She moved to the window bench and sat. Not because she had decided to stay, or perhaps because she had, and the decision had bypassed the part of her that usually required consultation. For a while, neither of them spoke. The grounds below were extraordinary in the broken moonlight. The black lake, a shifting mirror, the trees at its edge dark and absolute, the mountains beyond moving in and out of visibility as the clouds continued their slow transit. She had looked at this view hundreds of times. It looked different tonight, which was not the view's fault. "What are you carrying?" she asked. She heard him breathe. It was not a comfortable breath. It held something in it, a compression, the specific quality of a person deciding how truthful to be. "Nothing unusual," he said. "That isn't an answer." "No." A pause. "It isn't." She looked at his reflection in the glass. He was looking at hers. They regarded each other in the window's surface, that reversed, imprecise version of the conversation, which felt somehow safer than its direct equivalent, like speaking in another language, close enough to mean things, distant enough to survive them. "You don't have to tell me," she said. "I'm not asking because I—" She stopped, reorganized. "I'm not asking to catalogue it. I'm asking because you look like someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has perhaps run out of places to put it down." The silence that followed lasted long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. She was constructing the internal architecture of accepting this when he said, quietly and without looking away from her reflection, "I made choices during the war. Some of them, most of them, I made because I didn't think I had any other option, and some of them I made because I did have another option, and I chose the wrong one anyway. And I have spent a significant amount of time understanding the difference between those two categories and finding that the distinction matters considerably less than I expected it to. He stopped. She waited. The mark doesn't go away, he said. People don't. Another stop. His jaw tightened in the glass. I'm not asking for absolution. I understand what I am. I'm simply... He turned from the window. Not toward her. Away from both her and her reflection. Toward the alcove wall, as though he needed a surface that contained nothing looking back at him. I'm very tired, he said, of being exactly what everyone expects me to be. The words fell into the alcove and stayed. Hermione sat with them. She turned them over with the careful attention she gave to things that deserved it, not rushing toward a response, not filling the space with the first available comfort, because she understood that what he had said was not a request for reassurance, and treating it as one would be a form of disrespect. I don't, she said. He looked at her, sharp, sudden, the most unguarded his expression had been in all the weeks of her watching it. I don't expect you to be that, she said. I haven't. For a while I haven't. Something crossed his face. She could not name all the components of it, but she could identify the primary one. It was the specific, startled quality of someone who has been braced for a particular impact and has felt something entirely different arrive instead. Not relief, precisely. Something rawer than relief. Something that had not had a chance to compose itself before appearing. He looked away, but not before she had seen it, and not before he had understood that she had seen it. And the mutual acknowledgement of this sat between them with a weight that was not unpleasant, but was very, very significant. Granger, he said, and stopped. You don't have to say anything, she said. I know. He moved to the window bench, not to the far end, not with the careful spatial diplomacy they had maintained in their previous occupation of this alcove, but simply sat close enough that she could see, without the intermediary of reflection, the precise configuration of exhaustion in his face, the shadows beneath his eyes, the particular tension along his jaw that she now understood as the sustained effort of someone who did not allow himself many unguarded moments and was having one now against his better judgment. That's the part I'm not accustomed to, he said. What part? Not having to say anything. The moon found a gap in the clouds, and the alcove was suddenly, briefly, flooded with silver light, clean and precise, the way moonlight through old glass sometimes was. It found the angles of him with a specificity that the low library candles never managed, and she sat in it beside him and thought, with the clarity that occasionally arrived on the far side of exhaustion, that she was done pretending she did not know what she felt. She was not going to say it. Not tonight. Tonight was not the night for that particular irreversible act. Tonight was for something quieter, something that existed prior to declaration, the simple, enormous fact of choosing to stay. She turned back to the window. When I was in the tent, she said, during the war, when we were looking for Horcruxes and we had no idea what we were doing, and Harry was, and Ron had left, and it was just the two of us for weeks. She paused. I used to come to the entrance of the tent very early in the morning before Harry woke, and I would stand there and look at whatever landscape we were in, and I would feel. She pressed her fingertip against the cold glass. I would feel the specific weight of being the person who was not allowed to not know what to do next, and there was nowhere to put it. He was listening. She could feel it, the quality of his attention turned toward her fully, without the window as intermediary. I used to talk to my parents in my head, she said, except they didn't know who I was anymore, so it wasn't really talking to them. It was talking to the people they used to be and the person I used to be when they knew me, and neither of those things existed anymore. She removed her finger from the glass. I'm telling you this because you said you understand what you are, and I want you to know that understanding what you are is not the same as being finished becoming it. The silence that followed was the longest they had sat in together. It had a different quality from the others, not fragile, not maintained with effort, but settled. The specific quiet of two people who have said something true and are sitting in the aftermath of it. His hand was on the bench between them. He had not moved it there with any apparent intention. It was simply where his hand was, resting on the worn stone, close enough to the edge of her space that the distance between them could be measured in something smaller than inches. She did not move her hand toward it. She was very aware of not doing this. What was it like? He asked. Coming back. She thought about it honestly. Like wearing a coat that didn't fit yet. Like arriving in a country where you know the language, but the grammar has changed. A low sound from him. Not quite a laugh. Not its opposite. Something in between. Something that acknowledged the accuracy of the description from the inside. Yes, he said. Simply that. The moon moved again. The silver light shifted, softened, became something closer to ordinary dark. The alcove returned to its nighttime dimensions. Close, layered, honest in the way the dark spaces were when you had stopped pretending. She looked at his profile. He looked at the window. Between his hand and hers on the bench, a space of stone, cold and definite, that she was acutely, continuously, completely aware of. She did not close it, but she did not move away from it either, and they both knew the difference. And they sat together in the knowing of it, while the broken clouds moved over the castle, and the moon completed its slow work across the sky. And outside the tapestry, Hogwarts breathed around them in the patient, enormous way of things that have witnessed centuries of people arriving at exactly this precipice and have learned to simply hold them there until they are ready. She avoided him for 6 days. Not with the frantic, visible energy of someone fleeing. She was too precise for that, too aware of what conspicuous avoidance communicated to anyone paying attention. And she had reason to believe that Draco Malfoy was paying attention with a thoroughness that matched her own. She avoided him with method, with scheduling, with the quiet, surgical rearrangement of her daily movements so that the spaces they had previously occupied simultaneously became spaces she occupied at different times. And the corridors they had both travelled became corridors she travelled via alternative routes that added 3 minutes to each journey, and which she told herself were entirely reasonable choices based on traffic patterns, and not on the fact that 6 days ago she had sat beside him in the dark and told him the truth about the tent and the parents who did not know her, and had come away feeling simultaneously lighter and more frightened than she had felt in recent memory. She attended every class. She completed every assignment. She ate all 3 meals in the great hall at the regular hours, seated with Harry and Ron, and if her eyes did not travel to the Slytherin table, not once, in 6 days, not even the involuntary glance she had previously been unable to prevent. It was because she had made a decision about her eyes and was enforcing it with the same disciplined force she brought to every decision she made about herself. It was, she recognized on day 4, not working. Not the avoidance itself. That was functioning precisely as designed. It was the interior condition it was meant to address that was failing to respond to the treatment. She had expected that distance would produce clarity, that the specific, charged atmosphere of proximity to him would dissipate with sufficient space between them, the way a potion's effect diminished with time and fresh air, and she would be able to see the situation from a useful remove and make a sensible assessment of what, if anything, she intended to do about it. Instead, she found herself, on the morning of day 5, lying in bed at 6 in the morning, listening to the castle's early sounds and thinking about his hands. Specifically, the way they had rested on the bench in the alcove, close to hers. The particular quality of that proximity, deliberately maintained, she was now certain, because he was a precise person, as precise in his way as she was in hers, and he did not do things without awareness. He had placed his hand there and left it there, and the distance between them had been a kind of language, and she had answered it by not moving away, and they had both understood the exchange completely. She thought about this for 40 minutes before getting up. She thought about the way he had said yes, that single syllable, carrying the weight of everything she had described about returning to a world that had rearranged itself around your absence. The recognition in it. Not sympathy, which she had received from many people, and which skimmed the surface of the experience without touching its actual shape. Recognition. The specific acknowledgement of someone who knew the grammar of it from the inside. On day 6, she went to the library at the hour she had formerly gone and sat at her usual table and opened her books and did not look at the table beneath the arched window. She worked for an hour and a half with genuine concentration, which felt like progress. Her arithmancy notation was clean and correct. Her transfiguration essay was developing in a direction Professor McGonagall would find satisfying. She was, by every external measure, entirely herself. Then, Madame Pince moved through the stacks with her particular trolley, the one with the wheel that caught on the uneven flagstone near the charm section, and the familiar sound of it, the small rhythmic catch and release, sent her attention sideways in the way that sounds sometimes did when you were tired, finding the texture of a room you had stopped noticing. And the room she found when her attention slid sideways was the alcove behind the Barnabas tapestry on the 4th floor, and the broken moonlight, and the stone bench, and the 6 inches of cold air between 2 hands. She put her quill down. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Then she gathered her things with the decisive efficiency of someone who has reached the end of a deliberation that had in truth been concluded several days earlier and was only now being acknowledged. And she left the library and walked to the 4th floor with the measured step of someone who knew where she was going. he was not in the alcove. She stood behind the Barnabas tapestry in the empty space, with the window showing her the afternoon grounds in their late November austerity. The lake flat and pewter, the trees stripped back, the sky a high and uniform grey. And she stood there long enough to understand that she had arrived at a destination without considering the possibility that the destination might not contain what she had come for. This was unlike her. She turned to leave. "Granger." She stopped. Her hand was already on the tapestry. He was in the corridor. He had been passing. She could see this in the particular arrested quality of his posture, the forward momentum of someone interrupted mid-transit. He was looking at her with the tapestry half raised in her hand and the alcove behind her, and his expression was doing something complicated that she did not have time to fully decode. She let the tapestry fall. They stood in the corridor facing each other. Around them, the castle moved in its late afternoon way. Distant footsteps, the smell of the evening meal beginning to travel up from the kitchens, the low grey light thickening toward dusk in the high windows. "I've been avoiding you," she said, because she was done with pretense as a strategy. It had not demonstrably been effective. He looked at her for a moment. "I know. I needed to think. Did it help?" She considered giving a diplomatic answer. She considered several of them in rapid succession and discarded each one on the grounds that she had walked to the 4th floor with the specific intention of stopping doing that. "No," she said. Something in his expression shifted, very slightly in the way that his expressions shifted, which was never dramatically but always with consequence. He looked at her with those winter-pale eyes, and she stood in the corridor and let herself be looked at without the usual defensive response, without the automatic want to name it as a problem or issue a corrective statement or find somewhere else to direct her attention. She just looked back. "I said something," he said carefully. "In the alcove. I said several things, and you said several things, and I have spent 6 days not knowing what to do with what we said." "So have I," she said. "That's—" He stopped. His jaw held that familiar tension. "That is either reassuring or the opposite, and I can't determine which. I know that feeling." A beat. Around them, the corridor was emptying as students drifted toward the great hall, pulled by the gravitational certainty of the evening meal. In 2 minutes, the space would be theirs entirely. In 2 minutes, there would be no ambient social context to provide the modest cover of ordinary public proximity. She made a decision before the 2 minutes elapsed. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to understand that I've considered not telling you extensively, and I've decided that the alternative, continuing not to tell you, is worse. Not easier, worse." He was very still. "All right," he said, the same word, the same quality of patient reception. She breathed. She thought about the list on the inside cover of her charms notebook. 7 reasons this was not possible. 1 reason it might not be impossible, written in handwriting slightly less controlled than her usual. "When you look at me," she said, "the way you look at me, the reason it makes things difficult is not because I find it offensive or intrusive or presumptuous. It's because I—" Her voice was steady. She had decided it would be steady, and she was enforcing this. "Because I look at you the same way, and I have been looking at you the same way for longer than the last few weeks, and I didn't know what to do with that. Silence. Past tense, he said. What? Didn't know. His voice was very quiet. Past tense. She looked at him. Yes. The corridor was theirs now. The last students had turned the corner toward the staircase, and the dusk was coming in through the high windows with a particular quality of winter dusk. Not dark, but drained of colour, everything reduced to its essential shape. He took one step toward her, not closing the distance entirely, leaving enough space that what existed between them was still a question rather than an answer. His expression was stripped of its usual careful neutrality in a way she had only seen once before, in the alcove, in the moonlight, when she had said, "I don't expect you to be that," and watched something unguarded appear in him before he had the chance to compose it away. It was there now, unguarded. She could see what it contained. "Granger," he said. "Hermione," she said. It arrived without decision. If this is, you should probably call me Hermione." Something happened to his face. Not dramatic. Not the kind of visible emotional event she might have written into this moment if she had been describing it to someone else. Something quiet and internal and complete. A settling. The specific expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular word in a conversation and has finally heard it and can now proceed. "Hermione," he said. Her name in his voice was different than she had imagined, and she had imagined it in the dormitory at 2 a.m, in the margins of her attention during lectures, in the involuntary quiet of falling asleep. Imagining it had not prepared her for the reality of it, which was that he said it as though he had been holding it carefully and was now setting it down in its correct place. She pressed her thumbnail against the strap of her bag. He took the second step. She did not step back. They were close enough now that she could see the specific texture of tiredness in his face. The shadows she had noticed in the alcove, not gone, but different now. Different in the way that a weight looks different on a person who has decided to put it down. His eyes were very pale in the drained winter light, and they were looking at her with that look, the one she had spent weeks unable to name. And she was finally, in this corridor, in this dusk, done pretending she didn't know what it meant. It meant exactly what she felt when she looked at him. "I should have said this 6 days ago," she said. "You needed to think," he said. The echo of her own words returned without mockery. "I did." She looked at him. "I have thought about essentially nothing else for 6 days, and I've come to the conclusion that She stopped, reorganized, not because she was uncertain, but because the words were so large she needed to find the right approach to them. "I don't want to keep looking away from this." He was close enough now that she could see the slight movement in his throat when he swallowed. Close enough that the space between them was no longer a question of geography, but of will. "Then don't," he said. She looked at him, fully, directly, without the deflection she had deployed for weeks. She looked at him the way she had been looking at him in the accumulated privacy of her own mind and let it be visible. And he looked back at her with the same completeness, and the corridor held them both in the thin winter dusk while the castle settled around them in its ancient, patient way. His hand moved. Slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who understood the weight of what they were doing, he raised his hand, and his fingers, careful, tentative, asking permission in the movement itself, touched her face, the side of her jaw. the lightest possible contact, barely a pressure, more the awareness of warmth than warmth itself. She went entirely still. Not with the stillness of resistance, with the stillness of something that has been moving for a very long time and has finally, in this specific moment, arrived. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, once, with a care that she felt in places she had not expected to feel anything. "Hermione," he said again, and her name this time was not a word, but a question with her name's shape, and she answered it the only way she had left. She stepped forward into the remaining distance between them, and she looked up at him, and she said nothing at all, and he understood every word of it. His forehead came to rest against hers, both of them breathing. The contact so slight and so enormous that she felt the whole architecture of the last 7 weeks reorganize itself around it. Every look, every library evening, every word spoken in rain and moonlight and corridor dusk, arranging themselves into the shape of this. His forehead against hers, her hands finding the front of his robes, the winter light going soft around them. They stood like that for a long time, neither of them willing to be the first thing to move, and neither of them needing to be. The morning after felt like a held breath. Hermione woke before her alarm, before Lavender's gentle snoring shifted registers, before the first grey suggestion of dawn found the gaps in the dormitory curtains, and she lay in the dark with her eyes open, and the specific quality of consciousness that came not from rest, but from a night spent in the shallows of sleep, where the mind never fully released its grip on the waking world. She thought about the corridor, his forehead against hers, the warmth of his thumb along her cheekbone, and the way she had stepped into the remaining distance between them, as though it were the most natural thing, as though her body had simply recognized something her mind had spent weeks refusing to acknowledge, and had decided, finally, to act on the recognition without waiting for permission. They had stood like that for a long time, and then he had pulled back, just enough to look at her, and his expression had been the most open she had ever seen it. Not stripped bare, not raw in the way that vulnerability sometimes was, but open the way a room was open when someone had decided to let the light in. Careful, deliberate, chosen. He had said, "I'll find you tomorrow." She had said, "All right." And then she had walked back to Gryffindor Tower through corridors that felt reconfigured, as though the castle had quietly rearranged its geometry while she wasn't looking, and she had climbed through the portrait hole and past Ron asleep on the common room sofa with a Quidditch diagram on his chest, and gone up to her dormitory and lain down without changing, and looked at the canopy above her bed. She had not slept for a long time. She had not minded. He did not find her in the morning. She had expected this, or rather, she had expected the morning to be complicated, to require navigation, to carry the specific awkwardness of daylight, falling on something that had existed until now in corridors and alcoves and library evenings, in the private grammar of looks exchanged across populated rooms. Daylight was less forgiving than dusk. Daylight required different things. She went to breakfast. She sat with Harry and Ron. She ate toast with the methodical attention of someone who needed something to do with their hands and found the routine of it grounding. The weight of the knife, the specific resistance of the bread, the ordinary warm smell of the great hall in the morning. Harry talked about practice. Ron talked about something Percy had written in a letter that had apparently irritated him. Hermione made the appropriate responses and kept her eyes on her plate with the discipline of someone who had decided, deliberately and with full awareness of the effort required, not to look at the Slytherin table. She managed this for 7 minutes. Then she looked. He was there. He was speaking to Zabini with the contained lateral attention of someone engaged in a conversation they found only partially interesting. His tea was in front of him. His robes were immaculate in the particular way that his robes were always immaculate. She had once found this indicative of a kind of cold precision she associated with everything she had known about him. Now she found it simply characteristic, simply his. He was not looking at her. She understood, taking a careful breath, that this was not absence. This was consideration, the specific discretion of someone who understood that what existed between them had not yet found its public shape, and who was choosing, with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, to give her the space to find it without the pressure of his attention. She looked back at her plate. Something in her chest moved, warm and definite, the same low gravity she had first identified weeks ago in the Great Hall and had spent considerable effort misidentifying, reframing, arguing against. She did not argue against it now. She simply sat with it at the Gryffindor breakfast table and let it be the size it actually was. It was quite large. She buttered another piece of toast she did not need and allowed herself, in the privacy of her own interior, to feel the full, undefended scope of it. He found her at 2:30 in the library. Of course he did. She had known, arriving at her usual table with her arithmancy texts and her good quill and the collected composure of someone who had spent the morning in a state of patient, carefully maintained suspension, that this was where he would come. The library was theirs in some foundational way that neither of them had arranged. It had simply accumulated that quality through repetition, through the specific weight of all the evenings they had spent in it, in proximity and careful avoidance and gradual reluctant honesty. He sat across from her. Not at the far table beneath the arched window, at her table. The adjacent chair close enough that the space between them held no ambiguity. She looked up from her parchment. He looked at her. The look was the same. The look she had spent weeks unable to name, and then named, and then tried to retreat from, and then stopped retreating from. The look she had in the corridor last night, finally looked back at directly. In the afternoon library light, with students moving through the stacks around them, and Madame Pince's trolley making its distant rhythmic progress, the look was exactly what it had always been, and she received it exactly as she now understood she had always wanted to. Not as an intrusion to be corrected, not as a problem requiring solution, but as what it actually was, attention given freely, without demand. "Hi," she said. The word arrived unplanned and slightly startled her with its own simplicity. She had prepared, in the abstract, for a more complex opening, for something that required the precise vocabulary she usually brought to significant moments. Instead, she had produced one syllable of completely ordinary greeting and was now sitting with the fact that it was, somehow, exactly right. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. She was learning the taxonomy of his almost smiles, the slight variations in what his face did when something reached him before his composure could intercept it. This one was warm, specifically, privately warm, in the way of something that wasn't performing for any audience. "Hi," he said. She looked at him for a moment. He looked at her. "You're sitting at my table," she said. "I am." "You have your own table." He glanced toward the arched window, back at her. "I prefer this one." The warmth in her chest expanded with the unhurried certainty of something that had been given permission. She pressed it back to a manageable size and picked up her quill. "Don't distract me," she said. "I have 14 inches due Thursday. I won't distract you." She looked at him with the specific skepticism this statement deserved from someone who had been distracted by his existence across a full library's distance for the better part of 2 months. He met her look with an expression of such composed sincerity that she felt the laugh rise in her before she could prevent it. Not a full laugh, just the breath of one, the shape of it. And she pressed her lips together and returned to her parchment. She wrote, he read. Around them, the library did its quiet work, and the afternoon light shifted through the high windows in the slow way of winter afternoons, and the space between them was warm and ordinary, and completely unlike anything she had felt in this room before, which was that it was simply comfortable, simply real. 2 people sitting together in a library on a Tuesday afternoon, with no performance required of either of them. She wrote 3 inches before she became aware that he was looking at her again. Not the same look, different, quieter, more considering. She finished her sentence, set her quill aside, and looked up. "What?" she asked. He had his book open, but was not reading it. He was looking at her with that considering quality, and after a moment he said, "Last night." "Yes," she said. "I want to." He stopped. She watched him navigate the specific difficulty of someone who did not speak this language fluently and was attempting it anyway, without the defensive deflection he might have used a month ago. "I want to be certain that what you said was..." He stopped again. "It was," she said. He looked at her. "I haven't finished. I know what you're trying to ask." She folded her hands on the table, carefully, with the deliberateness of someone making a choice to be clear. "And the answer is yes. It was true. All of it. The looking at you the same way and not wanting to keep looking away from it. All of it was true." The stillness in him was complete and very brief. Then something in his expression settled. That same quality she'd seen in the corridor, that internal arriving, that sense of weight finding its correct resting place. "All right," he said. "Stop saying that," she said, without heat. "It's a useful word. It's one word. Most of the most useful things are." She looked at him across the table in the winter library light, this precise, complicated, morally grey, emotionally careful person who had looked at her across rooms for weeks with something she had spent weeks refusing to receive, and who was now sitting at her table with his book open and his composed expression carrying its small, private warmth. And she felt the full, quiet, enormous weight of what she felt for him settle into its correct position in her chest. Not frightening, not a problem requiring solution, or an argument requiring evidence, or a list requiring counter-arguments. Simply true. "Draco," she said. It was the first time. She watched him register this, the slight movement in his expression, the same quality as when she had said Hermione and he had set it down in its correct place. Yes, he said. She looked at her parchment, at her 14 inches, at the good quill she had brought specifically because she needed to concentrate. Then she looked back at him. "Come here," she said. He was still for a moment. Then he closed his book and he leaned across the table, not across the whole of it, simply forward into the space between them that had been closing by increments for 2 months. And she leaned forward too, and they met somewhere above her parchment in the middle of the library on a Tuesday afternoon, and his mouth found hers with a care that she felt in every extremity. It was not dramatic. She had expected, if she were honest, to feel drama. The specific emotional amplitude of a thing long awaited finally arrived, like the resolution of a chord held beyond its comfortable duration. She had expected it to feel like a conclusion. It felt like a beginning. His mouth was warm and careful and certain, the same qualities she had catalogued in every other thing about him, and she kissed him back in the middle of the library, with her hands still folded on the table and her eyes closed, and the winter light coming through the high windows and falling across both of them with the indifferent, steady warmth of something that would do this every afternoon, regardless of what occurred beneath it. When they separated, it was by very small degrees. She opened her eyes. He was close enough that she could see the particular pale shade of his eyes at this proximity, which she had not had occasion to observe before, and which she found she needed a moment to absorb. "I've wanted to do that," he said quietly, "since approximately the 3rd time you told me to stop looking at you." She pressed her lips together against another of those involuntary almost laughs. "Only the 3rd time. The first time was startling. The second time was interesting." Something moved in his expression, warm and specific. "By the 3rd time, I had formed opinions." She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them looked away. "You should know," she said, with the precision of someone making an accurate statement, "that I intend to continue telling you to stop looking at me like that." "I know." "And you should know that I'm aware it doesn't work." "I know that too." She pulled her parchment back toward her. She picked up her quill. She looked at her 14 inches and the 12 she still needed, and the 3 hours of Tuesday afternoon still available for the purpose. She felt his attention settle back onto her with the quality she had catalogued over 2 months. Patient, particular, warm. She felt it, and did not straighten her sleeve cuffs or grip her teacup or look immediately away. She simply sat with it the way she sat with things that were real and true and hers, and she began to write. Outside the library windows, the winter afternoon continued its slow transit. The castle held them both in the particular silence of its oldest rooms, the kind that had absorbed 1,000 versions of this same human gravity and had learned to hold it without comment, without ceremony. Just 2 people, on a Tuesday, finally looking at each other without looking away. And the particular, extraordinary, ordinary warmth of that being, at last, entirely enough.
I didn't want to write a love story about grand gestures. I wanted to write about something smaller, something most of us know but rarely talk about. That moment when you realize you've been watching someone, not because you planned it to, just because your eyes kept going there, and you didn't know when it started. You just noticed it one day that it had. That's what this story is about. Not declaration, not drama, just two people in a library, two people in the rain, two people running out of reason to pretend. Hermione is strong, we all know that, but strange doesn't protect you from feeling things. Sometimes the strongest people fall the hardest because they fight into longer. And Draco, he doesn't say much in this story, but I think that the point. Some people show you everything without saying a single word. You just have to be willing to look. I wrote this for everyone who has ever told someone to stop looking at them and mean the opposite. I hope it felt like something real because it was meant to.